Once again, it's time to consider the question, are we alone in the universe? For the last few decades, researchers have been finding life in every nook and cranny on Earth. Wherever we find water, we find life. And so it makes sense to extend that concept out to the rest of the solar system. We found water on Mars, on Europa, Enceladus, other places in the solar system. And the big question now is, can we find life on one of those worlds? And then there's the advancing science of exoplanetary research, where modern telescopes like James Webb can scan the atmospheres of exoplanets, searching for the various chemistry that make them up. And then we're listening for signals from other civilizations out there. And so this search for life in the universe is going on many different fronts at the same time. And one person who's been thinking a lot about this is Dr. Graham Lau. He's the senior research investigator at the Blue Marble Space Institute of Science. And he's been doing a lot of work with NASA and other researchers to both help conduct the searches for life across the solar system and the universe, but also to really effectively communicate the state of the industry to the public as much as possible. And so it's a real honor and a pleasure to chat with Dr. Graham Lau. Enjoy the interview. Graham, it's finally to meet you, I guess not in person, but at least virtually. We've been following each other's work for, I don't know, decades. And
it's been a long time.
and finally we just sort of chat. So this is awesome. Thank you for reaching out to me.
Yeah, I'm glad to join.
So for people who don't know, you are an astrobiologist. You work on a bunch of different projects, but just give us a sense of what you're working on.
Yeah, my career has been varied. And so I've worked on lots of different things, going from like geochemistry and polar environments and applying that to looking for life elsewhere. I'm now a member of the Center for Life Detection. We're trying to build a large web tool of biosignatures, signs of life, how we'll look for them on other worlds or using our telescopes. I'm part of the Interstellar Foundation, which are organizing ways of developing new messages for the stars, basically like the Voyager Golden Records, but kind of a new approach to many different kinds of records of what it means to be human here and now. I also have some other like just fun science communication projects kind of in the works, so just sharing astrobiology and helping others kind of find their careers or just exploring their passions and learning about whether or not we're alone in the universe.
So, I mean, people have wondered about whether or not we're alone in the universe pretty much as soon as we understood that Earth is a planet orbiting a star, and there's lots of stars out there. There's probably planets. Is there life on those worlds? And yet, I think back in the 60s, 70s, the question about whether we should be searching for life on other worlds wasn't considered cool, man. What sort of shifted in the sort of scientific thinking that said, okay, wait a minute, let's start thinking about what life might look like in worlds other than Earth?
Yeah, so I'll actually take the story back a little bit before that even, because it has been all of human history over millennia. We've been thinking about like these big questions, like why are we here? What is life? Are we alone? Like those are humongous questions that we've applied philosophy and religion and science and all these other ways of thinking to try to figure out like big questions about our existence. But in the late 1800s, this guy, Percival Lowell, who I'm sure your audience knows about, was an attorney turned into an astronomer because of his own passion, started using his telescope in Flagstaff, Arizona, which is now the Lowell Observatory, to look at Mars. And he thought he saw canals. And he wrote a book in 1895 suggesting that there was an advanced civilization on Mars who were irrigating water from the poles to the equator. H.G. Wells then wrote The War of the Worlds 2 years later. And like this whole realm of alien invasion sci-fi started. And like just last night, I was watching an old MST3K episode from the 1950s where they're watching like an old movie. It was pretty well known in the Western world in the early parts of the 1900s, especially 1930s, 1940s, early 1950s, that we weren't alone. It was just people just knew that aliens were out there. Mars had little green men. Venus had little green men. The planets were inhabited. And then it shifted. So like we weren't alone. There were aliens, there were humanoids and all these other planets around us. And then we started going out into the cosmos with spacecraft and exploring. Famously, Mariner 4, the very first flyby, Mariner 9, the first spacecraft to orbit around a planet, both going to Mars, showed us that Mars kind of appeared to be rather dead. from the outside. It didn't look like there were giant forests, as some had predicted, or ancient civilizations like remnants of buildings and giant ape people walking around because they'd lost their technology. And so a lot shifted, and for a little bit there was a period where okay, Mars is dead. Chances are the rest of the solar system's dead. It's just life here. At that same time, people were thinking actively about what's possible beyond our solar system, what's possible for alien life. And then you're right, like there was this big shift. So in the late 60s, kind of early 70s, a bunch of things started happening scientifically that kind of changed our thinking a lot. Amongst those things, one of them was the discovery of hydrothermal vents on the seafloor in the late 70s. 1977, the very first human team went down and saw one of these giant black smokers where seawater goes down into the ocean crust, gets warmed up by the mantle, and when it comes back out, it's enriched in metals and a lot of the chemistry of life. And so it builds these giant columns, and they found these huge tube worms and albino crabs and all kinds of things thriving in a place on Earth that we thought was dead. And so that was one of those moments where it's like, oh, we thought this was dead. Life couldn't be here. So maybe if we think Mars or other worlds are dead and life can't be there, maybe it actually could be. We're just not looking in the right way. We had a few other similar events. So finding extremophiles in those kinds of environments. One of the big ones was finding geothermal pools like in Yellowstone and discovering that there were many microbes surviving these super high temperatures around these geothermal springs and volcanic regions. And, applying that to like aerobiology, finding out that there's a bunch of stuff that just like survives being lofted into the atmosphere and we can collect it. All of those things coming together. And then also the discovery of the tree of life. Using phylogenetics to show that all the archaea, bacteria, all the Euryarchaeota, that we're all connected through this large tree of life, and we can show that using our genes and our DNA. It gave us this idea, like we can use a tool, a common tool in biology, to explore the history of life on Earth. Maybe if we can find molecules for information or metabolism or structure that alien life was using, maybe we could also understand its history as well. And then, of course, by the 1990s, things really started kicking off with the discovery of exoplanets, which has really opened things up a lot more now. And so it's been this large kind of up and down meandering of, we have to be alone. There could be alien life. Maybe we're not alone, and kind of just like working its way around. And now we're at this place where it really feels like if we're not alone, and it's still a big if, but it feels very much like we're not. But if we're not alone, it feels like we must be getting close.
I mean, it's, with those discoveries of the life around the hydrothermal vents and extremophiles and huddled up inside nuclear reactors, and just it goes on, that things sort of switched, that now if you find water anywhere on Earth, it's surprising if there's not life.
Yeah.
It's everywhere. Right.
Yeah, and even places that are kind of dry too. So like tardigrades, these little water bears who are kind of like the rock stars of the extremophile realm, they can survive desiccation, like losing most of their body's moisture and just be like this little compacted glob of cells. And then as soon as they get some water again, they can just kind of like fluff back up and come back to life. It's incredible.
Yeah, yeah. And so now when you think about the presence of water, like was that the second part of it, was the discovery of liquid water across the solar system?
I mean, that's been pretty big. So, for Mars, for instance, we keep having these discoveries of water on Mars. And we keep having them over and over again, which is kind of silly because we know that Mars had a wet past. It had a lot of water at some point, maybe even had an ocean, certainly had lakes and rivers. We can see that in just the geological formations of river deltas and the structures of canyons that have been eroded by the action of water. And we can see where water sat in lakes inside of craters. And so, NASA for a while in the astrobiology program had this vision of like follow the water was the term, that if we follow the water, there's a better potential for finding signs of life. But then we also have some other systems where maybe it's not necessarily just water, but having a solvent of some kind for metabolism to happen could be important. So like Titan, for instance, around Saturn, most likely doesn't have any kind of life as we know it at the surface. It is extremely cold. But it's still an interesting place to study an environment where there's a different kind of solvent as the liquid medium that could be possible for life to thrive in.
So, I mean, this story of following the water, NASA backed this up with a series of missions. You got Spirit, Opportunity, you got Curiosity, and most recently you have Perseverance. And yet the spacecraft have not had, or these rovers have not had the ability to to find life in the way that if I gave you a drop of pond water for your microscope, you'd be able to find examples of it. So, where are we at in matching the type of science that needs to be done with the capabilities of the missions that are actually being sent out into the universe?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really great question because, early on, we kind of thought like Mars was going to have life. Even after the Mariners, when we discovered that Mars looked barren, when we sent the Viking landers, it was still kind of thought maybe there could be some of the kinds of life like microbes that, we have on Earth that could be on Mars. And so the Viking landers had these biology experiments on board that very much could look for things like photosynthesis of modern organisms or things that have to break down organic matter and use it for their own building up of their cells and then respire CO2 the way that we do. And one of those experiments did have questionable results. Most in the scientific community feel like it was a negative result. But Gil Levin, who led the experiment, it was the labeled release experiment. Gil Levin, who passed away a few years ago now, he spent the entire rest of his life feeling that he had found life on Mars with this experiment. But I think in general, the consensus is that we just can't say yes or no on that one. It's interesting, though, we've never actually sent a similar experiment back again to look for respiration or autotrophy, basically these different ways that life as we know it gets its energy and lives. But we have had these more recent, rovers. So like Curiosity, part of Curiosity's mission very much was to look for possible ancient environments that could have life. So ancient habitable environments for life on Mars. And then within Curiosity's or Perseverance's mission plan actually is searching for biosignatures. And on board, it has, my favorite tool is the Raman spectrometer. It has, many great instruments, but the Raman spectrometer in particular could find organic matter that could be a biosignature, a sign of either past or maybe even present life in some of the samples from Mars. And then with Perseverance, we're also caching a bunch of samples that some people are really hoping we can bring back to Earth to do more research with that could also have diagnostic signs of life as well. And so we are slowly kind of getting back to it. I think one of the issues with sending instruments like we had on Viking is that they are very, very specific to one kind of metabolism or one kind of life, whereas a lot more of the current research is looking for what people call agnostic biosignatures. So things that could be signs of life, even if it's not Earth life. And so trying to be more open-minded to what kinds of molecules, what kinds of metabolisms an alien life might have, and also being, receptive to lots of different ways of looking so that we're not, putting, $1 billion into one instrument that can only look for one single kind of life. We feel right now like it's better to kind of like stretch our net as wide as possible. But who knows, in the future, we might have some kind of indicator and then send back some very specific instrument too.
Yeah, and that's what I feel is like Perseverance does have like the highest resolution. It's not exactly a microscope, but it's a very advanced lens that can see, magnify objects that are very small. And as you said, it has a mass spectrometer, it has a bunch of other systems on board, and it's collecting those core samples and holding them carefully for a future Mars sample return mission. But and there's this lag between what is the hardware that has actually been deployed and what is the state of the art that astrobiologists are thinking about for doing the next level of the research. And so, you sort of got these two main pathways available to you. One is bring those samples home, put them in the lab, and let the world's greatest scientists with the world's greatest labs really comprehensively check these exquisitely chosen samples for signs of life. The other option is send a more capable instrument to Mars. Do you think that the scientific community has settled on which of those pathways is probably going to be more effective?
I don't think so. And this is going to be contentious because I have a lot of friends who work on Mars sample return, who work for NASA, and they're very much as a big push right now to get Congress's support to get those samples back to Earth and do the research. But I personally, for myself, and I know I'm not alone in this, there are many in the field who feel this way, that we really could maybe do it better and faster if we just sent humans to Mars and sent some higher end instruments. You send a geochemist to Mars, that person can do more in 1 week than most of what our rovers can do in many months or a year. Because, the rovers, they have to move a little slower. We have to look at the rocks from afar here on Earth with the rover trying to help us. Of course, our technology for automation is changing. And so in the near future, we're probably going to have robots sent out into space on our behalf that have a lot more automation on board, that have their own machine learning processes, their own AI on board that helps them make determinations on the fly about what samples to take and what data to send home. But even with that, I still think there's a big push from many of us to get humans kind of moving faster and moving further and getting out to places like Mars where we could do a lot of work. And so, no offense to my friends on Mars Sample Return. I think those samples are really awesome and I'd love to get them back. But, at a certain point, we have to start weighing the costs, the trade-offs of how much money do we put into developing the infrastructure for Mars Sample Return versus how much money should we put into the infrastructure for getting higher end instruments to space, getting them through the whole process of being flight ready and allowed to go to space is big. But then also like getting humans out there using those instruments would also be a really big push for me as well.
But I mean, every part of a human mission is a scaled up version of a Mars sample return mission. You're sending a spacecraft to Mars. You're landing safely on the surface of Mars. You are doing stuff. You are then ascending back to orbit, meeting with a return vehicle, returning back to Earth, landing safely somewhere. It's the whole same process. Like I wouldn't feel comfortable sending a crew of humans until a Mars sample return mission had been completed, just because it's the same job, just scaled up.
Just bigger.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
That's true. And then humans coming back would most likely bring samples back the same way the Apollo astronauts brought a lot of moon rocks back. We have so many great rocks, and some still haven't been touched. Like we've been spending decades studying these samples they brought back. I was very fortunate. One of my office mates years ago in grad school, she had some of the Apollo 15 lunar rocks in our office, and it was just so cool just like hang out and see them as she was taking them to the lab and go do work. And it's pretty awesome. And so any human mission to Mars most certainly would be bringing Mars rocks back as well. And probably high quality Mars rocks. So you get a geologist. For instance, for the moon, the best rocks that came back from the moon came from the one geologist we sent. And so with Mars, send a geologist who knows what they're collecting. They're going to bring back some really awesome rocks, and maybe rocks that we couldn't get, from Mars Sample Return from Perseverance right now. But yeah, it would be awesome to have those samples back. Plus, there are things we can do in our laboratories on Earth that almost no human mission is ever going to do on Mars, at least not any time in our lifetimes or in next few generations. So like using synchrotron particle accelerators, for instance, these are gigantic instruments, $1 trillion instruments with humongous facilities where we use high energy X-rays to study the mineral chemistry of the rock samples in high resolution and map them out in nanometer scales and things like that. And we're not going to build that into a human laboratory on a Mars lander, at least not anytime soon.
And the other thing that I like about the lunar samples was a lot of it was put into cold storage with the assumption that better technology would be around the corner into the future. And what do you know? Better technology has come along, and they keep unfreezing samples and using the latest version of the state of the art. And whenever there's a step upgrade in what humanity can learn from the rocks, they make a few more available while keeping the rest in store, waiting for that future. And I'm assuming the same thing would happen with Mars. When you send your probe, when you send your robot to the surface of Mars or your lab or whatever, you're sort of saying, this is it. This is the best technology that we're capable of sending today to examine the samples. Having them back at home would allow you to test out into the future.
Yeah, but it is a lot to design and develop those still. Like we don't have the infrastructure in place yet for Mars Sample Return. And so it will be a large undertaking bringing these samples home. And then, a lot of people are wondering, like, how we're going to analyze them here on Earth too. Does it go to a BSL like level 4 lab first? Do we build a new laboratory just for Mars samples? So there's a lot of questions yet about the whole infrastructure we have to build around getting those samples home. And so, currently with where Congress is at, Mars Sample Return hasn't been canceled necessarily yet, but they've been basically told that they have to figure out how to do this infrastructure within a very specific amount of money, which is not a lot of money in the way things work in space exploration. And so it is a challenge right now for my friends and colleagues in the Mars Sample Return realm who are trying to figure out how we can get the money allocated and maybe even increase that money to get those samples back.
Well, don't worry. We're not constrained by any of that pesky realism here in this conversation. We'll let our imagination fly free to what's possible. So then, you mentioned briefly that there's this idea of sort of agnostic methods of of searching for life. So can you give me some examples, like how does an agnostic method compare to one that is searching for a much more well-known method?
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, a great example is the Viking biology experiments. So it's something like labeled release, like we're giving a nutrient broth of a very specific number of nutrients to the soil in the hopes that maybe some microbes who eat those kinds of nutrients the same way that we do will then break them down and respire a radio labeled carbon inside of the nutrients as carbon dioxide. Um, and so it would happen to us if we took radio labeled Snickers bar and fed it to a human. You would eventually breathe out CO2 that's radio labeled as well, and so we'd know that you ate you consumed that piece. But it's very specific to a very singular approach to biology, of eating certain kinds of organic molecules, breaking them down, respiring CO2. Um, but then more agnostic methods would maybe look, instead of like feeding a broth and hoping that it eats that broth, would be looking for, all the kinds of amino acids we can find in a sample, or all just the organic structures we can find inside of a sample. Like, so a mass spectrometer is one of the best tools for that. There's different ways to break down the material and then to analyze it in the mass spectrometer. And then we can kind of rebuild from there to figure out what the organic molecules that are present were. That gives us a much better idea, just in general, of like the chemistry of the sample, of the environment, and whether or not those organic molecules may have been produced by life. Right now there's folks like Lee Cronin and Sarah Walker who are working on this idea called the assembly theory, where they have this idea, of the steps it takes to build up from very simple, basic building blocks, atoms to molecules, and building larger and larger molecules that life uses. That we can kind of like trace back through the pathway of all the steps necessary to get to building something very complex, and that there might be like a window where life itself is kind of diagnostic, because it take a lot of steps at a very specific kind of pathway to get to these more complex organics. But also things like Raman spectrometers and infrared spectrometers are really great just for giving us an idea of the organic chemistry present. When it comes to things like DNA, we could send an instrument out into space to Mars or into the ocean of Europa to try to look for DNA and maybe even look for genes, but that would be very, very specific to life as we know it. It's quite possible that alien life out there doesn't even use DNA, or if it did for some reason also come upon using RNA and DNA like we do, it might not use the same bases. So DNA has 4 nitrogenous bases that link together inside of this long double helix. It might be possible alien life using DNA uses different bases. Or even if it uses the same bases, which would be kind of remarkable, it might not use the same coding. So the way DNA works for life as we know it, every 3 bases come together as one single code for one amino acid, with a little bit of wobble room in the back. So some of them get coded by multiple 3 codons, we call them, 3 amino acids together, to get to that point of having DNA with the same bases we have, with the same coding structure. And then if it's using the same kinds of genes that we have, that almost demands that it's also life as we know it, and we have a shared origin, or it's contamination. If it's truly alien life, there's a good chance it's either not going to use DNA, or it's going to use DNA in a much different way.
So let's imagine a blank slate, and you sort of have knowledge about all of the different places in the solar system that are interesting to astrobiologists. If you could sort of make a priority, and again, budget is no object here, where would you love to start? If either to send a crew of astronauts or have a sample returned, no matter how, you want something from the core of the sun, we got you. But
man, those are all like different questions though. And I'll even throw in time. So if time weren't a factor, say we have a time machine, say we can somehow like get like a spaceship DeLorean and we can travel back in time in the solar system. My favorite planet for possible life besides Earth in our solar system is Venus very early on. And so Mars was much colder early on. It definitely had water. It probably had a much thicker atmosphere. It could have been a great place for life, but I think Venus was probably the better candidate early on. Venus, we think, might have had an atmosphere much like Earth now, might have had oceans. It's very similar in size to the Earth. It just underwent, some different geological history than we have. It didn't have a nice moon stabilizing it like we have. It's now gone through this runaway greenhouse effect, so the atmosphere is super thick and the surface is super hot. It appears like the entire surface melted maybe 500 million to a billion years ago. We don't quite know why yet. That all happened. Maybe it didn't have plate tectonics, so everything got stuck in place and then just melted and kind of like flipped over and the whole surface melted out. And so maybe there aren't any signs of life remaining on Venus from those early periods because of that. But I really do love that we had that, that recent potential finding of phosphine in the atmosphere of Venus, and it kind of got people interested in Venus again, and makes us want to send some more missions back. We've had so few missions to Venus; we need more. And even though I don't really know, I'm kind of skeptical that we're going to find signs of alien life in the clouds of Venus and its atmosphere. It's still worth looking. So that'd be a great place to go early in the solar system history to see if life was unfolding there. If we're sending humans out, I think Mars is the best option. Beyond the moon, going out past our magnetic field and getting out into our solar system. Mars has a nice rocky surface. We know that humans could land there and support a habitat there. People have done a lot of really great work showing that we could use the Martian atmosphere and the Martian regolith, the soil of Mars, as resources, as building materials, to make rocket fuel, to make breathable oxygen and water. There's so many resources on Mars for supporting human life. And then when it comes to just looking for alien life in general, if life can start in oceans, and we don't know yet if it can or not, there are some debates right now about whether or not life started on Earth in the ocean versus on the surface or came from somewhere else. But if life can start in oceans, then maybe worlds like Europa and Enceladus are really the places we should be getting to as fast as possible to go look for life.
So let's say that your crew of your time machine crew returns and they've got a sample from early Venus, or the Europa crew returns. You've got these samples, and in one sort of outcome, it does have DNA and feels very similar to Earth life. What do you think are the implications for that compared to the one where it is clearly not the same kind of biological structure as Earth life?
Yeah, and in that case, it almost feels like it has to be a shared origin. Now, like alien life there might be like an imperative, like a biological drive to use DNA for information in the universe. That's quite possible. But again, if we find like a sample from early Venus or a sample from Mars now, and it has what appears to be life, like the signs of life, and included in those signs are DNA, and it's DNA that uses the same 4 bases as us, and maybe has a similar code of the codons, that would almost suggest we have some kind of shared origin very early in our history. Now, I love the idea of panspermia, the seeds everywhere, that life could be raining down on early Earth from Venus. Maybe we're Venusians, or maybe we're Martians. Maybe life started on Mars and then came here. However, it does seem like life started here on Earth at some point very early in our history. And so it almost feels like life kicked off as soon as it possibly could on Earth. And so we're not quite sure why yet that happened. But all the processes for life to have started maybe on Mars or Venus first and then come here, it's not impossible. It's just the window of time for that to have happened before life has taken hold here seems very, very small.
And for the other way, if it turns out to be completely unrelated to Earth life, what are the implications for that, do you think?
Yeah, alien, wildly alien. And it could use an entirely different information system. There are people out there who've been looking into different kinds of molecules that might serve in the kinds of ways that RNA and DNA have. Right now, a lot of people think that maybe early in Earth's life's history, that RNA was the key molecule, that RNA, some great researchers have shown over the years that RNA can catalyze reactions. So it doesn't just store information the way DNA does, but RNA also can drive forward reactionary processes that could be the earliest metabolisms themselves were being done by RNA. It was storing the information for how to copy itself. And then that eventually built out into this larger system of the central dogma that we have in Earth life biology of the DNA, RNA, protein, kind of the wheelhouse of how biology functions for life as we know it. But maybe we'll find alien life that uses a much different information system, maybe a different system for catalyzing reactions. Maybe it doesn't use amino acids to build proteins the way that our life does and builds up, cellular structures with all these kinds of enzymes and stuff inside of them. And honestly, like the potential for alien life is it's kind of fun. One of the reasons I love astrobiology so much is that there's so much possibility. And so you start kind of like going in between the science and like the science fiction of just like dreaming of what's possible based on our knowledge of chemistry and physics.
Um, a question I get a lot from people is, astrobiologists are always talking about life as we know it. I think you've probably said that 10 times in this interview already. And they will sort of dismissively say, why aren't scientists looking for life as we don't know it? Why aren't you looking for life as we don't know it?
I would argue that a bunch of us are. And so like the whole like agnostic biosignatures, the whole idea is to look for life as we know it and life as we don't know it. So looking for like the full complement of the kinds of organic molecules that could possibly be used. And I've talked to lots of people who are like, maybe water is not the solvent for alien life. And I agree. Maybe it's supercritical carbon dioxide. Maybe it's liquid nitrogen. There's a lot of possible things out there that alien life could come upon for a solvent. And then also like carbon-based chemistry. The life here on Earth is carbon-based. And so people have talked for some time about the possible like silicon-based life forms that could be out there. Early Star Trek had an idea of silicon-based life in it. But there's a lot of reasons why carbon is a really good atom for being the backbone of the organic chemistry that we have. It's far more stable. The bonds are far more stable than silicon. And if you have a water-based life, that silicon-silicon bond is actually unstable in water over very long time periods. A lot of people wouldn't think that, but like it is true. Now, if you have silicon and oxygen together, like silicate, like quartz is extremely resistant to weathering and is very stable in water, but quartz wouldn't make for a great alien life, we think. And so there are other possible systems besides water, other possible, backbones besides carbon. But, it does seem like water and carbon are great. And so it does make sense for us to look for kind of, life like that, at least in our early attempts to see life out there. But, in the science fiction realm, people have thought for a long time about like how wildly alien could alien be? Could there be like an alien consciousness that we would never recognize materially? By looking at samples, so like Stanislav Lem had Solaris, this idea of like a conscious planet, and the humans it was trying to communicate with them, but the humans didn't really realize that because they weren't able to understand that level of consciousness, and they weren't looking in the right way for the alien life. And certainly other science fiction authors through time have given us some really fun ideas for how alien something really could be.
Now, and you're going to have to sort of check me if I get this wrong here, but life, we use 20 amino acids for our life and like life on Earth, but there are dozens, 80, 100, hundreds of amino acids potentially out there. And many of them have been seen just forming in space, just out of the raw ingredients in protostellar nebulae and things like that. And really feels like the mechanisms that these amino acids are arriving on Earth fully formed, and then something got them going. So when you think about those alternative pathways to life, are there other stable structures like silicon version of amino acids, stuff that is also sort of readily forming in protostellar nebulae that could serve as the base for an alternative form of life?
Yeah, and that's a great question. The immediate answer is no. We don't see like large silicon chains coming together and then having heteroatoms. So that's where you have like a chain of silicon with another atom kind of linked in the same way carbon does. We don't really see that forming anywhere in the cosmos. And that doesn't mean it's impossible. It seems very unlikely. And carbon, just there is more carbon in general, just due to the stellar processes that form carbon out there. But yeah, you're right. Like we look out into the interstellar medium, we see amino acids and sugars. Like we found all of the basic building blocks of life already, basically in the interstellar medium, in cometary material, in asteroids. Like everywhere we look, we're finding basically the building blocks for carbon-based chemistry.
But not the building blocks for other forms of chemistry in ways that we might sort of see it coming together.
Yeah, not so much.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I wonder, that's the part that I think has been so fascinating to me over the last probably couple of decades, is just how many of these amino acids are being found. The samples from Ryugu, the samples from Bennu are just filled with organic material, amino acids fully formed, ready to go. And we know these things are raining down on Earth. The question is just the velocity. Are they surviving re-entry? Are they gently sprinkling down on Earth, or are they, burning up in a ball of fire?
They also form here too.
Yeah, no, of course,
Yeah.
absolutely. But it's one step easier if you just have the
Mhm.
stuff all delivered to you by space.
Oh yeah.
So, the other, we've talked about searching for life here in the solar system, but the other method, and you talked about this earlier, is the discovery of extrasolar planets. Now we're at the point, thanks to James Webb and other telescopes, that we're actually analyzing the atmospheres of extrasolar planets. And I think, if you talk to those astronomers 20 years ago and you said, hey, in 20 years, you'll be analyzing the atmospheres of the planets, they would have said, oh, well, then we would know which ones have life and we would know which ones wouldn't have life. You would know the biosignatures because you'd just be looking at the atmosphere. Well, here we are. And that has turned into a very complicated subject with no real answer. So what is sort of the state of the art for understanding whether or not you're seeing a biosignature in the atmosphere of an exoplanet?
Yeah, there's been so much work in this realm, and you're right. Like the paradigm was like if we looked at an exoplanet and we could see its chemistry, if we saw oxygen, we'd know it was alien life. Like that was a big belief. Like that, since oxygen here on Earth is a biosignature, it's made by living things. It's maintained in our atmosphere by living things over time. It was thought if we find an alien world that has oxygen in its atmosphere, it must also have photosynthesis with oxygenic production of this oxygen being produced and put out into the atmosphere. But some great people like Vicky Meadows and some others have done really great research showing that oxygen might not be the biosignature we thought. There might be many geological processes to form oxygen, and a lot of it now we're looking kind of more systems level now of the chemistry of atmospheres. And so a lot of people are thinking, not just about like one single molecule that we can look at, but like what is the complement of the different kinds of molecules in the atmosphere. So like on Earth, we have oxygen, but we also have methane in our atmosphere, and oxygen and methane are not in equilibrium in any way whatsoever in our atmosphere. If we just capped off the entire surface of our planet tomorrow, the oxygen would oxidize the methane over time, and the methane would just disappear. And so there's a disequilibrium in our atmosphere of oxygen and methane. And there's many other possible kinds of chemistries that can happen inside of atmospheres from both geological processes as well as biological processes. And so the big thing right now, I think a lot of people are thinking kind of more like, what is the complement of chemistry? Are there any molecules that are kind of out of disequilibrium together? A big thing too is like, can we observe the atmosphere over time? It's like we're just now getting those first measurements, but we're also going to have JWST out there for some time. And then soon we'll have the Habitable Worlds Observatory, HWO, which is going to be even more powerful at looking at these atmospheres and finding more worlds. And so we'll have even more observations. So if we find a world that appears like it might have some interesting chemistry, we might also be able to follow it over time and get other measurements. We might even see like seasonality. And seasonality can happen from a bunch of things. There can be, obliquity, basically the way that the planet tilts can shift really quickly. That can cause seasonality changes in its orbital structure, moons. There's a lot of things that can cause seasonality. But along with that, we could see a change in the chemistry being driven by seasonality. And that could be a fun indicator for possible biology. And personally, I wouldn't be surprised at all if we find like a potential, like a possible sign of maybe biology in an alien atmosphere rather soon, but then getting to the point where we scientifically can say, oh my gosh, it's an alien world. That might be a bigger jump and actually needing some more dedicated time and research on that one world. And just bringing a lot of scientific minds to bear on the problem, going through the whole process of debate of what's possible, both from the biological standpoint, the geological standpoint. And so, we don't really know yet, but it could be possible that we'll find those signs soon. And then also, on top of that, some people are wondering, maybe we'll see signs that aren't just biological, but on top of that comes the technological signs as well. So colleagues of mine like Jacob Hock-Misra and people who've been working on exoplanets for some time are now interested, like, could we see industrial gases? So we had chlorofluorocarbons that humans were producing as aerosols for a long time. And, famously, we found out that we were destroying our ozone layer with these chlorofluorocarbons we were creating. And so a bunch of nations got together and signed this Montreal Protocol to cut back on our CFC production. But we still have CFCs in our atmosphere. They'd be there for a long time. Aliens, say 20, 30 light years away, looking at our world with their James Webb Space Telescope, they might be looking for our industrial pollutants to see that we have a technological society here. And there's certainly other kinds of realms of industrial molecules that could be formed that would be very difficult to form both through geology as well as like a more rudimentary biology. So like life itself is less likely to produce some of these larger kind of industrial molecules that could be signs of a technological civilization being active on a planet. And that would be probably even a better way of finding alien life, is that if we actually saw a sign of technology of some form, it'd be a bigger jump. And, it's the same thing as having a picture of like a Martian turtle walking in front of a rover would be a much bigger sign of alien life than us, looking through some organic molecules from the soil. And so, it's kind of like these different levels of like how strong is the potential finding.
Yeah, I mean, it's a twofer, right? You see an advanced civilization, and also you found life, right? As opposed to you've got a sort of an ambiguous discovery of life. And I wonder, there has been a real resurgence in the last probably decade or so. People like Jacob Ackminster, as you mentioned, Jason Wright. There's a lot of people who are sort of forming this new community of people searching for techno signatures. And I think, although it seems weird to search for aliens, in this what has long been a fairly, I don't know, looked down upon subject, and no funding has been available for it. Finally, the floodgates have opened back up again. But what they offer is this unambiguity, right? That you receive a signal from a very intelligent signal coming in the radio spectrum from some star that you can decode into a binary code, and this is not a maser, this is aliens. Do you think that is a more that's a pathway that could get us closer to the goal of detecting the presence of just any life at all?
I mean, yeah, because it'd be more obvious. You see a jump and you see a signal. So like SETI, like looking for signs of extraterrestrial intelligence, if we actually got a signal and it was a non-random signal that we could say, really statistically, like this is a signal sent from an intelligent being or civilization out there, I mean, that is life detection. It's kind of like it's one of the most promising forms of life detection, because it almost instantly tells us not only are they there, but they've also developed. They've also gone through an evolutionary process. And so it would make me instantly wonder, like, what is their biosphere like? What is their civilization like? Do they have any of the same issues that we have? Any of the same, the really incredible things that we've done too, like in developing our culture and our art and math and science and all these things that we've done? I'd want to know more almost instantly. Whereas if we just find possible signs of life, maybe like a past alien life from Mars, which would still be pretty huge, I think a lot less people would be as impressed by it. And I say that in a sad way. I honestly, I'm so worried that we're going to find alien life, and that so many people are going to be so busy in like the 24-hour news cycle and the outrage of the internet, they're just not going to care. And we'll be over here like, oh my gosh, we just found out we're not alone in the universe. Like, we need to explore this more. But I feel like if we find a message from an extraterrestrial civilization, I think that would be a much bigger game changer for a lot of people.
I still think you need to go back to your original assumption that even if we did have this sort of mind-bending discovery that we're not alone in the universe, that there's a vast federation of aliens out there communicating with one another and sending their spacecraft from star to star, people would be like, yeah, but the price of gas, and would go back to their regular day. Like, I think there's only so much existential awareness that a human being can go through before they have to just focus on the day to day. And so, yeah, we would have a moment where everyone was like, wow, we're not alone in the universe. But anyway, what's on TV?
Yeah, I'm currently, in my current work, I just gave my first TEDx talk, and I've been thinking a lot about like awe and wonder and how astrobiology and the search for alien life kind of plays into these larger perspective shifts. And it brought me back to this story, that the Piper at the Gates of Dawn, an old story from The Frog and the Toad, from The Wind in the Willows. And in this story, Frog and Toad are helped in finding a friend by this forest being, like this natural deity of nature, who is so powerful that the sheer act of awe and wonder that they experience in seeing its presence, that their minds can't handle it. And so it has to like give them amnesia to make them forget the experience, so that they're not so shocked that they can't keep on like living their day. And it's kind of the same thing, right? Like, so it's this worry that like we could be faced with something extremely deep, an existential acknowledgement that we are not alone in the universe, which honestly, as many of us have hoped in the past that it would like unify humanity and bring us together, and we'd break down these national borders we've built upon ourselves, and break through our otherness and all these, this xenophobia and nationalism and all these things that we've developed. As much as I'd hope that be the case, I think it is a lot for a human to stand and gaze into the abyss, and actually feel that awe and wonder of the bigger existential questions. And it's part of what drove me towards this in the first place, is just that, I think a lot of us want to engage with awe and wonder in those kinds of unique and just very special ways, and then also find ways to share that with other people too.
Yeah, you sort of imagine after the discovery of another civilization, you're at the restaurant and the waiter comes up and says, like, what you all have to like to eat? And also, isn't it just mind bending that we live in this universe where there's other civilizations, and every sentence ends with, and also don't forget, after a while that'll slip away and we'll just get back to our regular lives. We'll have some awareness, but as long as it's not hitting us on that practical level, I think people,
unless it's like Independence Day. Unless they show up and they start coming down in our atmosphere,
of course,
and they force us to acknowledge the change.
Yeah, but I think people have predicted that you'd have sort of the complete destruction of religion and various ideologies and so on. And I don't see it. I think human beings are capable of just incorporating almost any knowledge and just moving on like nothing has happened. And so that's people like you and me, we will be constantly assessing about it. But I think for a lot of people, it's not that they don't get the implications. It's not that they're not interested in it. It's just they're busy and they only have so much bandwidth to spend thinking about that kind of thing. And so, no, even if if the most important question that humanity has ever asked, are we alone in the universe, got answered, it still wouldn't really dramatically change the way we live our lives. That's my feeling. But
I feel that way too.
Yeah. Which I think is, maybe that's a good thing, that it's sort of like we're capable of dealing with a lot psychologically and still moving forward, no matter what the sort of the news is. So then, with the sort of vast range of methods that we have available to us, both sort of searching for interesting biospheres here on Earth, we can't build the time machine, but we can analyze the atmosphere of Venus. We can look at Mars. Eventually we'll go under the ice on Europa and Enceladus. We're searching for technosignatures. We're searching for biosignatures. Which of those methods do you feel is going to get results first?
Ooh. Man, that's like asking me to throw out a bet on all of my friends' research in different places.
Yeah. They're not going to watch. Don't worry about that.
So I don't. So I mean, I don't know. So like, as much as I love Mars and I think we should explore Mars, I'm still a huge fan of Venus. And I don't know if I'd put down money that we're going to find life in the Venusian atmosphere, but man, that'd be so cool if we did. And I talk a lot with Bruce Damer. He and his colleague David Deamer. They came up with this idea of the hot spring hypothesis. They've been arguing that life can't start in oceans, that life needed like wetting and drying cycles on the Earth's surface to take off early in Earth's history. If that's the case, then Europa and Enceladus are dead worlds, and there's no point in looking. And others have also certainly argued that, being much smaller worlds with a lower heat inventory, that they might be less likely to actually produce the kinds of systems we would need to build any kind of living inventory. But all of that said, man, Europa and Enceladus are so freaking cool. I mean, these deep oceans underneath icy crust, and like with Enceladus, it's blowing its water out into space. We can fly through the plumes coming out of the ocean. That's incredible. And my friend Morgan Cable at JPL, she was working on this very cool robot. It's not getting funded right now, unfortunately, but it was called EELS, the Exobiology Extant Life Surveyor. And it was like this like long crawling snake-like thing that they could figure that could like climb down into the cracks, these tiger stripes on Enceladus, and maybe even get into its ocean, which would be so cool. And then with Europa, a lot of people know that Europa has its ocean down below that icy crust. They don't know that the icy crust is probably thicker than any ice we have on Earth by a long shot. If it's 10 kilometers thick, that's over 6 miles of ice. We don't have any place on Earth that has that much ice, nor have we ever drilled straight through 10 kilometers of ice. And so getting down there is going to be intense and a process. And yet there are really cool people out there doing great research on how to do the drilling, how to deploy the robots down below. The ice fin robot that Brittany Schmidt and her team, for instance, are working on is a really cool example of a robot that could one day go into the ocean of Europa. And there's just so much water down there, so much possible inventory for the chemistry to actually happen. If there's any chance that life can start in an ocean, then man, Europa might be just a giant, fishbowl full of all kinds of weird things inside of it.
But Titan takes it to the next level. You take a Europa and then you wrap it in organic molecules.
Yeah, so Titan, we don't know for sure if Titan has an ocean. There is some potential that Titan might have a subsurface ocean, just like these other icy worlds do, but we don't know because we don't really have enough data for that from Cassini to say for sure. But Titan could have an ocean, or maybe even just like subsurface water lakes in the near surface. But then at the surface, it's so cold that water is rock. Water is just ice at the surface, and then it's this inventory of organic gunk everywhere. Like the sand and the water, the liquid there is actually organics. It's ethane, methane. Like all these organic molecules. They go in the atmosphere, and the sun, even though it's so far away, the sun breaks them down, and it's raining this haze of weird organic chemistry. I mean, even if there's no life on Titan, just getting there in the first place to explore is cool. And so, like the Dragonfly mission, I'm just super excited for. Having this drone flying around in this thick atmosphere full of organic gunk to better understand the geology there is going to be just a huge endeavor for humans, and just one amazing feat for us as well.
So let's fast forward. It's 50 years from now. There's a permanent base on Mars, on Europa, on Enceladus, on Titan. The Habitable Worlds Observatory 2 has been launched and has been analyzing the atmospheres of every good exoplanet within 100 light years of us. And still, no biosignatures have been found. Nothing's been found in the solar system. We're getting to this point where we've sampled a pretty significant chunk, a statistically significant sample of the Milky Way. What do you think are the implications then, I guess, for your career?
Yeah, I'd say, so right now, most of what we're looking at right now is within like 1,000 light years, roughly, kind of, pretty close to us in the Milky Way. So we're still just looking at like our little corner of the much bigger galaxy. But yeah, let's say it's like 2050 or even 2100 or something. And we're kind of looking out, now we have a much bigger view. Maybe we're 5,000 light years or 10,000 light years out, and kind of expanded the bubble of worlds that we can see and resolve with our telescopes and our technologies. Even then, like it could just be that we are in a quiet corner of the galaxy. But as I often tell people, like there's this really big bummer that we have to admit, based on our current evidence, that we could be alone. That is one possible answer to the question. It feels like it's very low probability. Because the more we look out there, the more we understand that life as we know it has taken hold in many environments across our planet. It can evolve and adapt to so many different situations. We've now found environments on other worlds that seem like they could be, hospitable, maybe habitable for life as we know it, and maybe even other forms of life. And we're now finding so many exoplanets. Just the analysis of the statistics of alien worlds alone tells us that there's probably at least 400 billion, I think probably more than a trillion planets in our galaxy alone, and then billions of other galaxies. It starts to feel like we just can't be alone, that there must be something else. But man, it would be pretty weird if we don't find alien life, say in the next 50 years or century, or say even crazier, like a millennium passes by and whatever organism it is that lives on Earth at that point that has replaced us, that the Chat GPT progenitor, kind of like going off and making more AIs that eventually take over, or maybe start building the paper clips, going through that experiment. Maybe hasn't found alien life. It'd be pretty weird, but it's not impossible.
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of your colleagues have done these estimates that it's 1 million years, it's 10 million years to completely explore the entire Milky Way with self-replicating robot probes. Like that is a scientific question. We can get the answer to it. You just need to wait for the technology and wait for the data to come home. And so, when we think about, we now, for the first time in the history of humanity, have the ability to answer this question. Like it is a scientific question, and the tools have arrived to let us start answering this question. And just like we have to be emotionally prepared to deal with the reality that we live in a vast cosmos filled with aliens who we haven't met and we don't understand them yet, are we psychologically prepared to deal with the possibility that we're alone?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, these are grand questions, and it's part of what drove me towards astrobiology. Admittedly, sometimes I look back, I'm like, man, I should have done philosophy. I love big questions, and I think a lot of astrobiologists are kind of like that too. Like they want to know if aliens are real, but a lot of them also just really like big questions, in physics or geology or biology or oceanography, whatever is driving them. A lot of times the people I talk to on Ask an Astrobiologist, the show that I host for NASA, I talk to all these other researchers from across the realm, and almost all of them, they love these big questions. Many of them are fans of science fiction. They love dinosaurs. I can't tell. I think almost every single person I've had on the show has at some point, either during the show or in like our prep, just like talking about their interest, has mentioned how they wanted to be a paleontologist when they were a kid.
Yeah, guilty.
They love dinosaurs.
Guilty
they love
as
dinosaurs in
charged.
space. Dinosaurs in space. Like it's like these two things that like kind of like connect these people together. And I think a lot of us just really, have this burning passion to answer these bigger questions that have been part of humanity for so very long.
Graham, what are you obsessed with?
Oh man, my current jam is really going into this realm of awe and wonder. I've been a meditation instructor and practitioner for quite some time now. As a young person, I started training the martial arts, and that kind of got me more into learning about, Eastern spiritualism and religion. And that, now the older I get, the more I kind of just want to understand like this human experience and what it is, what consciousness is, and study, of trying to better understand our place here in the universe, which includes questions about whether or not we're alone. I just coined the term the Panzoic effect. So my friend Frank White, very famous author, he wrote the Overview Effect in 1987. This idea that astronauts have this psychological shift potentially when they see the Earth from space. And my idea is that maybe looking out as well is also a perspective shift, just the sheer act of thinking that maybe we're not alone in the universe, and kind of just allowing your mind to entertain what that means, and actually having that existential experience could itself be a shift in how you feel empathy towards other human beings and towards life here on our planet. It makes you feel both insignificant because of how little we are in the grand scale of the cosmos, but then you also find that there's a significance because we exist, we're here, and that by itself gives us significance. And we've done so much together, we've created so much, and even though people can easily point out all the things we've done that are terrible, and even today in our world we still face so much tragedy and loss and pain, and the suffering is still great on our planet. But even in the face of all that, there's still so much love and hope and reasons to be good for each other and for ourselves.
Yeah, I find as I get older, that sort of self-knowledge comes a lot more easier to me, where you sort of catch you sort of a mindfulness circuit has revealed itself and is now running, where I'll be like, oh, it's time to lift weights. I don't want to lift weights, and then part of your brain goes, you said you'd say that, sir, and then you're like, okay, fine, I'm gonna lift. And I find that also makes it easier to sort of, as you said, sort of start to appreciate the perspective of other people, and sort of think about what they might be going through in a way that's more agnostic and even more empathic. And it feels very good, it feels very satisfying to go through this process. It's sort of one of the, I guess, the advantages of getting older is that you have sort of more wisdom that you can bring to bear on these kinds of problems.
Yeah, wisdom begins in wonder, but it also requires at least some experience.
Yeah. It's to maintain the awe and the wonder, your head in the clouds, but build firmer and firmer roots on the ground so that you can be that conduit between what is possible and what is practical to affect change in the world. I know this sounds really, very mystic, but And I like that. I feel more effective now in my career than I've ever been. And yet and I don't feel like I've lost one iota of my childlike wonder, which I think is great.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. Well, Graham, thank you so much for taking time to chat with me, and good luck. If you do find the aliens, would you let me know?
Absolutely. I'll tell everyone.
No, me first.
Just
then we break the story.
It'll be amongst us.
Yeah. Then we break the story on Universe Today. We get the scoop, and then feel free to tell everybody else.
And then we share the Nobel Prize together. Of course.
No, you can have that. I just want the scoop. so
you
that
go.
everyone will, the traffic. All right. Thanks, man. We'll talk to you later.
Amen.
I hope you enjoyed that interview with Dr. Graham Lau. I had a really good time. It was great to catch up with him. Now, I'm going to give you some final thoughts, but first, I'd like to thank our patrons. Thanks to Abe Kingston, Adam Schaefer, Barry Lake Roofing, David Giltonen, David Matz, Dennis Alberti, Dustin Cable, Jeremy Mattern, Jim Burke, Jordan Young, Josh Schultz, Paul Robach, Spiderswap.io, Stephen Krasaki, Stephen Fowler-Munley, and Vlad Chiplin, who support us at the Master of the Universe level, and all of our other supporters on Patreon. Once again, we're sort of back to that age-old question, is are we alone in the universe? And, we don't have the answer to it yet. And I think for a lot of us, we feel very frustrated that we happen to arrive at a time in the history of the universe, in the history of humanity, where we don't have a definitive answer to that question. But I feel grateful that here I am at this age in my life, that at least the ability to answer that question has arrived in the spacecraft that we're sending to other planets, in the abilities of amazing new telescopes like James Webb and the upcoming Habitable Worlds Observatory, the bandwidth that's being set aside for SETI to be able to listen for signals from other civilizations, and all of the thinking that's going on by researchers in a place where it's really actively encouraged by the funding agencies. So although we don't know the answer to the question, at least we now have the ability to answer that question. And, I and the rest of you, we get to watch this process unfold, to watch this mystery get examined, and hopefully, still within our lifetimes, we will find out an answer. And this will mark this milestone in the history of humanity. There will be the time before we knew the answer to the question. There will be the time after when we knew the answer to the question. And for those of us now, we will watch that answer come. All right, we'll see you next time.